Only a day after Jesus had thrown a fit in the temple courts, turning over the tables of the money changers and knocking over the seats of those who sold sacrificial doves, he is back. Literally back in the same location. And this time, he's teaching openly and roasting the religious elite, much to the delight of the crowd who was gathered. This was crunch time for Jesus. It was the Jewish Passover, and Jerusalem was filled to the gills with pilgrims from all over. They would necessarily have been in and around the temple, which was the center of Jewish life, and never more so than during Passover. Jesus is letting the religious elite of his day have it, in no uncertain terms. The Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, and priests, Herodians, all of them, left and right, exposing their deeds in detail. As if they weren't already frustrated and opposed to what Jesus was teaching and to the rumors about him being the Messiah, this was fuel to the fire, and they boiled against him. There was no holding back. Our text for today zooms us into a moment of Jesus' teaching that finds its emphasis in the actions of a widow living in poverty. Jesus turns to the crowd and says, "Watch out for these scribes. You know the ones. They've got all their fine robes on and waltz around like they're hot stuff. They love to get compliments and respect and sit at the places of honor at every party and dinner they can attend. But meanwhile, in the shadows, they foreclose on the houses of widows under the guise of doing Yahweh's work. They are the ones responsible for that, and they will be judged accordingly." The text says that they devour the houses of widows. In that time and in that culture, there was very little separation between financial governance and religious institution. This seems really strange to us, but the temple was often the center of commerce and trade, and not just at Passover. Just imagine that the Fed suddenly merged with the evangelical Christian church, which is terrifying. And because the religious leadership made so much profit off of people less fortunate, they became a source of money lending as well. And as a result, a source of foreclosure when borrowers could no longer make their payments. And to make matters worse, the financial services always came with a sanctimonious mixture of pious prayers, making it obvious that they were still doing the Lord's work, leaving people like widows to beg on the street after losing everything that they had. The Jewish temple system was old. Their way of ordering their society was old. It had been around for a long time and was not unusual to anyone, Jesus included. For Jews, there was no separation of church and state. The church was the state. It was a society that is hard to understand from our perspective. Jewish history and Jewish identity was very heavily influenced by the suffering and mistreatment they had undergone together. The Jews were consistently conquered and in exile. Many times they came close to losing their identity altogether as a result of those experiences. The creation of many of the books of the Old Testament was a direct attempt to preserve the historical identity of the Jews for future generations. All of the oral traditions, the tales, the wisdom stories, the handed down traditions of their interaction with Yahweh were compiled and written down in an order to band them together, to cement them as a particular group of people. Not that group of people, but this group of people. The Jews were oppressed to the point that it was literally the Jews against the world. Their suffering tended to drive them inward and cut them off from the rest of the world. They were spiritually and culturally isolated on purpose to protect themselves. The other day I had a conversation with someone, and it really stuck with me. It was one of those conversations that sneaks up on you and you don't really know you're in an uncomfortable situation until it's too late. I really do my best to keep from taking part in political conversations as much as possible for a lot of reasons, but this conversation blindsided me. It started out with comments about how horrible COVID had been for everyone and how we were all suffering from various levels of post-traumatic stress syndrome, getting easily frustrated or angry or more road rage, less patience all around, less trust in some circumstances, and this lingering sense that people are just on the verge of blowing up at any moment, which comes with a lot of social anxiety. And I was all on board up until that point, and then out of nowhere, suddenly the conversation turned to how we in America were inches away from socialism and communist rule, and how our country was doomed to failure without certain political and religious intervention. I was told in no uncertain terms about how the Christian church has a responsibility and a God-given mandate to help turn our godless country back to the Lord and to Christianity. And then this person used a phrase that might sound familiar this morning, and I haven't been able to shake it. It keeps ringing in my head over and over. And I said, well, I guess it's just us Christians against the world. Right in the middle of today's gospel reading, Jesus gives us an obvious scene change, because he sits down opposite the treasury where people are publicly casting money into large vessels. Some are casting more publicly than others, often with elaborate announcements of how much they were giving and what it was for. As he sat down and looked at the scene of rich people making a big deal of their offerings, just then they watched as a poor widow quietly shuffled to the vessels and unceremoniously tossed in 2 coins, which together would nearly make a penny. They barely made a sound or a difference in the total amount in the vessel. Jesus drew their attention to what he was about to say. Truly, I tell you. That's what he said when he was about to say something really important. Basically, I kid you not. This poor widow has given more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. They gave out of their abundance, but she gave out of her poverty. Everything she had, all she had to live on, she gave out of her poverty. The widow's act of giving is astounding. It's heroic. Out of the poverty she experienced, she gave not just a little, she gave everything. And we could stop there, and it would be a challenge to us about the nature of our giving and whether or not we trust God with everything we have. It would be a warning that those of us who have an abundance will be judged more strictly in this world. But there is a deeper reality at play here in this story. She gave out of her poverty everything she had, but she gave into a system that was ultimately responsible for oppressing her into the very poverty from which she gave. And we miss that almost every time because we stop at the heroic act of her gift. But when you take a step back, you start to see a pattern. Jesus' point as he entered into Jerusalem with the prophecy of the destruction of the temple, his point the day before in disrupting the temple market, and his point in this discourse that included the poor widow was to expose the corrupt and dying reality of the religious system at hand. And to contrast that with the reality of the kingdom of heaven, the reality of God in flesh among us and in us that stands against the injustice and oppression of the institution of that day. Jesus was the Messiah, but he turned the idea of being the Messiah on its head. He was the embodiment of God, the essence of the universe. His experience of that caused him to empty himself and take on the form of a servant, a poor man, who ultimately gave everything he had to show the world that reality had shifted from an understanding of God aligned with power and oppression and corruption to an understanding of God who dwells in the poor in spirit, a God who dwells in the meek, who dwells in the merciful, the peacemakers, you know the list, those who mourn, who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the pure of heart, the persecuted, for the kingdom of heaven, the reality of the essence of God is in them. The tables have literally turned in a universal sense. The problem with spiritual movements is that humans eventually turn them into religious institutions. It happened with Christianity in just over 300 years. And for 1,700 years after that, the institution of Christianity has grown and become more powerful and, unfortunately, has become renowned for its ability to oppress and corrupt and abuse. Like all institutions, there are some parts of it that are great and do wonderful things and look at times a lot like Jesus working in the world today. But the decline that we see around us in this institution is directly related to the religious institution of Christianity winding down and dying. The institution, not the kingdom of heaven, not the essence of God alive and at work in people. The reality that Jesus revealed through his life and death is the new reality of the world. Christ in us, the hope of glory. Jesus even said, I am in God and you are in me and I am in you. There is one God, the essence of the universe, above all and through all and in all. And when we give ourselves, everything that we have to God in that system, we are giving into a system that brings absolute and total freedom rather than oppression and abuse and guilt and shame. The less we try to grasp and hold on to the religious institution, the more we see the absolute necessity of giving everything we have to join Jesus on his path, to become like Christ, joint heirs with Jesus, as the old hymn says. It's the difference between being a part of a religion about Jesus and being a participant in the religion of Jesus. Institutions pass away, but the reality of God endures forever. It's the church with the world. Amen.